This is a Tomioka 55 f1.2, the Auto Revuenon version. I think it's one of the most interesting film-era lenses, and it's certainly one of the more expensive old lenses to buy. In this review, I'll explain why I chose to buy this lens over other ultra-fast lenses, and then I'll show you how it performs. To save time, I've split some of the discussion about whether you need an f1.2 lens at all, and comparisons with slightly slower lenses, into a separate video. Let's just say, after a lot of deliberation, I decided to take the plunge and buy one. I considered a long list of film-era f1.2 lenses. There may be other lenses I missed, so please add them in the discussion below. And today there are some very costly new ultra-fast digital lenses, as well as some less expensive options. I wasn't too fussed about the make or mount. I was willing to buy a new adapter for the right lens, as long as the adapter worked okay on my cameras, of course. I had some selection criteria, which are pretty self-explanatory, and I'll tell you whether I felt the lens met these criteria during the review. Now clearly I couldn't try all these lenses myself, or even try a short list of lenses, so I relied on reviews and photos posted online, as well as discussions in forums. Some of the more famous lenses just didn't seem to be worth it compared to good f1.4 lenses. Sometimes, ironically, because they were almost too good and smooth wide open. There wasn't enough of a wow factor in the images. And I also learned that I preferred the perspective of lenses that were slightly longer than 50mm. So to cut a long story short, based on my research, I decided to buy a Tomioka-made 55 f1.2, and I found an Auto Revuenon version at a reasonable price. At the time, these lenses tended to be less costly than the other Tomioka versions. Tomioka produced 55 f1.2 lenses for different brands, and they don't all have the same physical design. They have different styles of focus ring, for example. I do believe the lenses in this box have identical optical designs, but I have to say I've never seen conclusive proof of this. But please comment below if you have more information on this. Anyway, let's start with the lens's physical and optical design. It's an M42 screw mount lens, made in Japan between 1970 and 1974. If you splash out on one of these lenses, then you're not going to be disappointed by its physical appearance. It's quite large and chunky, and weighs around 340 grams. As you'd expect, it has a satisfyingly large expanse of glass in the front and rear elements. I find it's well balanced on both larger full-frame digital cameras and smaller mirrorless cameras. It's certainly more compact than some of the large Fast 50 beasts that are being manufactured today. The only physical downside with the Auto Revuenon is that over time the rubber that covers the focus ring tends to shrink and separate from the body, and the rubber can become a little tatty. I prefer this as all made of metal, as some of the other versions are. The lens has 7 elements arranged into 6 groups with 8 aperture blades. For stop-down shots it's probably better to have more blades, but 8 blades was quite a common configuration for ultra-fast lenses in the 1970s. The lens has radioactive glass that turns a golden brown over time, unless someone has cured the discoloration under UV light. Personally, I'm not overly concerned about using lenses with radioactive glass, and this lens is not the most radioactive one I own anyway. I've opted not to cure the glass of its golden tint. I rather like the images it produces, and the tint can be reduced in post-processing. But one issue is how much does this tint reduce the amount of light passing through the lens? It's a bit of a dilemma, because why buy an ultra-fast lens only to see its speed reduced by tinting? Sounds like a contradiction in terms. Well, yes and no, because it's not just the fastest light transmission you're looking for with these f1.2 lenses. Indeed, I didn't buy this lens to help with low light situations. My digital cameras are pretty good at doing this themselves. No, what I'm interested in is the extremely narrow depth of field wide open, and how the lens renders out of focus blur, and hopefully it's a superior lens stop down as well. One other thing you'll notice is this rather odd design and shape of the rear element. It's not round, it's been cut, and all the M42 f1.2 Tomioka lenses have this feature. Leaving aside the technical reasons why it's there, you may wonder if it shows up on images, impacting the shape of light artifacts in the bokeh. And the answer is yes, it does show up sometimes, as you can see here. I don't find these shapes too distracting, and they don't always appear, but wide open you have to accept that they may be there, almost winking at you. And this brings us on to how the lens performs in practice. And I'll look at this by considering the lens's performance against my original selection criteria. When you take a photo at f1.2 close up to an object, and this lens's minimum focusing distance is 0.5 meters, then you can't expect anything other than a sliver of the image to be in focus. But I think it's fair to say that you do want that in-focus sliver to be relatively sharply rendered. An image that is all blurry is not so good and lacks a sense of depth unless you're going totally abstract. Well, I can report this lens is reasonably acceptably sharp wide open for close-up bokeh type shots, as long as you nail the focus. For infinity type shots, on the other hand, you have to stop down for a sharply rendered image. Nailing the focus is never easy at f1.2 shooting close-up objects, because there is so little margin of error in focusing on the precise area you're trying to photograph. For example, I was convinced this image would be sharp wide open. It was fine at f4, but with the same focal length on the lens, on a tripod, I just missed the critical point of focus wide open. Zooming in, I reckon it only missed by about 1 millimeter. And the lens can produce some ghosting around the in-focus areas, especially in bright light situations, and this doesn't always help the image to look completely sharp. It becomes a matter of trial and error to get the focus right, and I often have to take more than one shot of a close-up object to try and get a sharp result, ever so slightly adjusting the focus for each shot. To demonstrate this, here's a good test to look at, because all of the photos I've shown you so far have been processed in some way, to bring out the contrast, colours and fine details. The key message is not that the images need processing, but that the raw materials are all there in the original images to make something even more eye-catching. However, the next two images are straight out of a full-frame camera, so you see what you get before processing. This one is stopped right down, and it's impressively sharp for an old lens. Now we'll transition to wide open, and look close up at the sharpness. It was quite a challenge to nail the focus on the writing, even using focus peaking and zooming in electronically on the image. In fact, I took 7 separate photos to find the sharpest one. Each image looked, from focus peaking, like it was focused sharply on the lettering, but I made minuscule adjustments to the focus for each one, because focus peaking, while useful, is not detailed enough for a lens with such a narrow depth of field. I only found the right one by looking at the images blown up on a computer screen. And at this point, it became apparent that the bottle had a very slight curve that was actually making a difference to the focus points. So there's no doubt that getting that wafer-thin area of focus right is very challenging wide open, and it may be something that ends up frustrating you quite a lot. Now on to perhaps the main reason to buy an f1.2 lens, and that's the wide open bokeh it produces. One thing I'd noticed about the lens from photos posted online is it can produce a kind of tunnel effect to bokeh, like this. I've had a lot of fun playing with this effect. I enjoy the results. In reality, of course, images like this are compositional tricks that use out-of-focus objects in the foreground and the background, and the lens's extremely narrow depth of field. You can produce similar effects with, say, f1.4 lenses, but it's not so dramatic. If you look at a wall of lights photographed out of focus, you can see that the lens doesn't actually produce a tunnel effect. This bending of light towards the outer edges of the frame is consistent with other fast 50s. Leaving aside this particular effect, the wide open bokeh is lovely. It's soft and smooth and dreamy, and the slightly tinted pastel-like colours can be very beautiful. When you look at stop-down to wide open transitions, you can see how effectively the lens zaps the background details. Busy backgrounds simply disappear, and on a 1.5 times crop sensor in particular, with an equivalent framing to an 82mm lens, it's a very fast, supercharged perspective. While we're looking at these images, it's worth noting that the lens doesn't produce a huge amount of chromatic aberrations. You can see some purple fringing and purple blotches in very bright light, but not so serious it can't be dealt with in post-processing. The lens makes an attractive portrait lens stopped down a little, with still a rather dreamy look, but less obvious fall-offs from in-focus areas of the face. Wide open, the depth of field can be too narrow. The negative in stopping down is that where there are highlights in the image, the blades start to show quite quickly, and for this reason, you may find better luck with a good f1.7, 1.8, or even f2 fast 50 lens for these types of wide open shots. Which brings us on to the performance of the lens stopped down more. And while I'm talking about this, here's a series of transitions from wide open to stop down, going through the main stops marked on the aperture ring. I've added the stop between f1.4 and f2 as f1.8. These are all taken on full frame and are straight out of camera except for downsizing. Some people claim that these f1.2 lenses are amongst the best performers of all fast 50s stop down because they have such great glass, and in the film era they were designed to perform exceptionally well stop down. It wasn't so much about wide open bokeh shots. Based on these and other transitions taken close up, I found the lens begins to sharpen up very well by f4. Indeed, it becomes very sharp for an old lens, as it should do for its price and quality. And the lens performs well across the frame for shots taken at infinity. Here's a test shot of a railway station taken at f8. It's rendered very nicely, not as bitingly HDR sharp edge to edge as the leading modern fast 50s, but it has a charm all of its own. And stop down, I'm more than happy to use this as an all-purpose walk-around lens. I enjoy using it with both crop and full-frame sensors, and for black and white images, as well as colour. One important observation of colours through the stops: wide open, the radioactive tint is less obvious. Stop down, the colours can become less natural, with more of that radioactive tint. This transformation in colour rendering is something you can see with other old lenses, not just this one, and it may require some post-processing to adjust. One other notable and sometimes exciting characteristic of the lens involves the way it flares. If you enjoy playing around with lens flares, and I'm talking about serious flaring and shapes, not light leaks and patches, then this lens is one of the most creative film-era lenses I've tried. The lens flares extravagantly in bright sunlight with the right compositions, and you can alter the effects by changing the aperture. Indoors, with bright light sources, it produces large and very clear shapes you can move around the composition, and again change with different apertures. And it'll even flare at night alongside the starbursts. And finally, we need to talk about the cost and value for money of buying such an expensive old lens. In terms of my selection criteria, I didn't set a budget, but I did want to get the right lens at the right price. I've noticed that prices for old ultra-fast lenses were moving all over the place online. Some sellers placed a big premium on these kinds of lenses, while others had lower prices. So it was a matter of waiting for the right seller and lens to turn up. There are clearly pros and cons involved in using such a lens. It's not a lens I use all the time, and I never take it on family holidays, it's too valuable. I have much cheaper, lighter, more beaten-up fast 50s that take excellent family photos. There's no doubt it's a specialist lens, an ultra-fast lens that a number of people rather disparagingly say is purely about bragging rights. Like a Ferrari, for example, very expensive, not particularly rare, and it'll still only get you from A to B when there are other much cheaper options available. However, on balance, I think it's worth getting a lens like this if you can afford it. It's a lot of fun to use, with very creative wide-open images and flares, as well as very decent stop-down results. At a time when many lenses, and increasingly mobile phones, are really just tools for taking as perfect an image as possible, this lens is a real challenge. It'll keep you on your toes, it's frustrating to try and nail the focus wide open, it's harder work finding the right scenes and compositions that make it shine, but sometimes, on a really good day, it'll produce some exceptionally beautiful and interesting photos. That's the end of the review. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'd like to end with one last comment about my choice of lens. The Auto Revuenon lens was an entirely personal choice based on the images I'd seen it produce. If you're interested in buying an old f1.2 lens, I'm sure you'll do your own research. The bokeh from different ultra-fast lenses wide open really can vary, from smooth to funky, and whether or not you like the bokeh of a particular lens is very much a matter of personal taste. I'm not even going to claim that the Tomioka is the best performing lens. It just happened to produce the kind of rendering I was looking for. Or maybe I should say that other photographers posting online happened to be taking photos with the Tomioka that I liked. Because I'm absolutely sure the other ultra-fast 50s on the list can also produce great images. It's just that I didn't always see great examples online. And sometimes where lenses produced bokeh that I didn't like, perhaps that was down to the compositions rather than the quality of the lens. Unless the lens is ultra soft wide open, in which case there's not a lot you can do about that. So please comment below, not just on the Tomioka lenses, but it would be great to hear your experiences with other old ultra-fast 50s.